Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 31st of August. Today we're doing a frontline update, but we're going to begin by looking at the explosions that occurred in Feodosia in Crimea. So let's open up the video of that over here. So I've now added in like this little feature where you can see the video on the custom map on Google. So you can see this on my map, and now I'm going to play these in my videos. I know it's a bit small, but it just gives you an idea of what happened. And just to summarize the reports from both sides, on the night of August 30th, the Ukrainians, they tried hitting Crimea, specifically the city of Feodosia, which is more on the eastern end of the peninsula, which makes it more difficult. But the head of the Crimean Regional Administration, he said that the Russian anti-aircraft units were able to down a cruise missile, but some Russian sources actually believe that it wasn't a cruise missile, but that it was a Tupolev Tu-141 jet drone that was utilized, and that the Russian 31st Air Defense Division had actually shot down the UAV, and that in the process of shooting it down, the UAV, the shrapnel that was caused by the explosion, it actually caused a power line to get damaged. So Crimean officials, as I said before, alleged that it was actually a Storm Shadow cruise missile, while I've seen many Ukrainian sources say that it could have been a Neptune anti-tank missile that was reconfigured to hit ground targets. Now, I've seen a lot of reports from Ukrainian side specifically saying that there were actually 3 cruise missiles involved, not just one, and that only one of them was intercepted by Russian air defense systems. I can't confirm that. I have no idea because we have not really seen any footage on the ground, at least to my knowledge. I was looking for it. I couldn't find any. I couldn't find any from this specific geolocation, but this is where a lot of people have alleged that the strike occurred in this region, and it would make sense because the Ukrainians were aiming to attack energy infrastructure in all likelihood. And the reason why is because Feodosia is known for 2 things that could be of use for the Ukrainians. First of all, it has large oil reserves, so that could be one thing that could be targeted. And the second thing is that there are electrical substations in Feodosia. For instance, the one that I have in that marker, which would be over here. And there's also one a bit further to the northwest. I think it's over here. So you do have several different electrical substations which connect to the wider Russian energy grid, and they're very important for Crimea because this is actually the entrance point for a lot of the electricity as it goes and it gets dispersed to the rest of the Crimean Peninsula, to other key cities like Sevastopol, Simferopol, Yevpatoria. So that would be why the Ukrainians would want to damage the power lines over here. They would want to try to cut off the access that Crimea has to electricity that comes in from the rest of the power plants that generate the power in Russia proper. So that's just the information that I have available to me. Now, if we look at the Kherson front, and I'm going to zoom in, there are reports from the Russian side that the 126th Odessa City Defense Brigade, a part of the TDF, that they had some of their elements, probably like DRG units, that landed on the other side of the Dnieper River, on the Russian side of the river, about 4 kilometers to the northwest of the village of Pidstepne. So that would be around here, and some of the farmlands around that area, and that they were supported by speedboats that provided them with equipment, provisions, all of that at night. And this means that the Ukrainians have sort of relaunched their activity around Kozachi Lahari in that general direction. It is further to the west because Kozachi Lahari is over here, and the reported Ukrainian activity was around here. But for a couple of weeks, we didn't really hear much about the Ukrainian forces in this region. Maybe that's starting to change. It is too early to tell. But you have supporting the 126th TDF Brigade, you have the 121st TDF Brigade that is also in the region and it's providing support. So you have those 2 units. And if you zoom out a little, you'll also know that the 406th Artillery Brigade is now operating in the regions further to the west, around here, around places like Bilozerka and Tomina Balka, and they're firing onto these Russian reconnaissance forces that are operating on the islands that are in between the Russian and Ukrainian lines in a gray zone. So the Ukrainian artillery is actually hitting these Russian forward reconnaissance infantry in areas like this, where I have these red rectangles located, And that just confirms that these areas are a gray zone that neither side has full control over. And then vice versa, you also have the Russians hitting Ukrainian forces in this region that have been operating, DRG units that have been operating like we talked about in previous videos. I actually have a video linked here of the 126th Territorial Defense Brigade, and they hit a Russian trench with an FPV drone. I think there was like one casualty from the video, but the point is that the Russians are dug in over here. You could see that their fortifications are pretty close to the Dnieper River, actually. They're about 2 kilometers away. And you now know, based on that video, that there are some Russian defenders that are in a forward echelon on these defense lines that are marked on the map with this light green color. And that just gives you an idea of where the Russians are defending. Now, moving on to the situation around Verbove, I want to talk about the alleged breach of the Russian defensive lines. And I talked about this specific video in my last video, but when I talked about it, it was right when it came out. So now we have more commentary on the situation and we have a better idea of what's going on. There's still a lot that's unknown. But honestly, I don't want to get caught up in the semantics of the word breach, because breach just means to like go through a gap of something and then to like break through it. I want to just give an accurate assessment of what's going on. So let's look at the video again. Here you have the Ukrainian forces, presumably 82nd Air Assault Brigade, entering into the northwestern parts of Verbove. They weren't actually in the village in this video. They were in a hedgerow that was very, very close to it. So you can see how the Ukrainians had this route built for them. They paved the way, and it was through this specific road that is adjacent to a hedgerow, and that's what they used for concealment to reach that far deep into the Russian lines. Now, people will wonder, where are the Russian trenches in this area? Well, you could see these green lines over here, and you'd assume, oh, these are the Russian trenches. Well, they're not actually. These are Russian defenses, but they're not manned. These areas that I'm going to mark over here, these are actually anti-tank ditches. I'm marking them in blue. So the first layer is an anti-tank ditch, and then behind that anti-tank ditch, you have Dragon's Teeth. So it's pretty clear why they were set up over there. It's because the Russians probably assumed that the Ukrainians would be using their mechanized forces. They'd be using armored columns, whether it be Bradleys, Leopards, main battle tanks, anything like that. And that was the reason why they set up those ditches. And then behind that, in case one of those tanks or vehicles were able to get past the ditch, then you have the Dragon's Teeth. That was clearly not meant for infantry, but it was maybe meant to sort of divert the Ukrainian focus away from sending mechanized columns in that direction and instead opting to use their infantry on foot. And so then what's the second layer of Russian defenses? Well, I'll mark that in red. The second layer of Russian defenses over here around Verbove, just to the west of it, is this manned trench. And that manned trench spans all this area over here being marked in red. So you have about an 800-meter gap in between the anti-tank ditch and the manned trench that the Russians have their forces located in. So I'll just measure that for you guys so you get an idea. Actually, a bit more. It's about 1.5 kilometers at most. So what's in the area in between? Well, it's just open fields. There's some hedgerows over there. So I guess if the Ukrainian infantry, they get past the ditch, which they can easily do, and they just maneuver past the Dragon's Teeth, which is also pretty simple, then they'd be in this completely open area. They could see concealment in the hedgerows, some of these hedgerows, but a lot of this area is relatively open, which does make it harder because the Russians will be in their trenches. They're going to be with ATGM crews, small arms fire crews, so they're going to be firing onto the Ukrainian forces. So then it's interesting to see how the Ukrainians will try to respond. For now, what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are concentrating a lot of their efforts, pushing through the hedgerows, pushing through the northwestern direction to attack Verbove head on. That's what we've been seeing a lot of based on the fire maps where we're seeing most of the fighting occur. Here's the FIRMS map, the fire map from NASA, and you can see that most of the fighting is going on in the northwestern corner, or at least most of the shelling, and that shows how the battlefield has shifted in that direction. So since the posting of this original video of the Ukrainians being shelled in the northwestern, just to the northwest of Verbove, we've not received any additional proof of the Ukrainians past the defensive lines like the anti-tank ditch, but I do think that it's likely that the Russians have already fallen back to the manned trench. They may have some forward reconnaissance operating in the fields over here, try to slow down the Ukrainians, but I think most of their forces have already fallen back into the village itself or to the surrounding trenches, and the Ukrainians are already beginning to send some of their smaller groups on foot, no vehicles, past the defensive lines, but there's just not enough evidence to say that they entered the village yet. Also, what I'll say is that there's a lot of fighting going on to the southwest of Verbove, which is just as important, if not more important. And that's going on around this hill over here called Heights 110-3, or I've seen some people call it Hill 166. That was another claim from the Ukrainian side. That's what they were calling it. And the reason why this hill is so important is because currently Russia is controlling it and they're using it as an observation post. It's a good post to view the Ukrainians that are advancing through the open fields to the east of Robotyne and trying to flank Novoprokopivka. It's a good way to view the Ukrainian forces that are advancing from the northwest towards Verbove. And the Ukrainians, they want to flip the switch. They want to take it over and then use it for their own means. They want to use it for their own observation purposes and then to attack Russian forces on a local level. And that's also why this hill is built behind the defenses, because the Russians don't want it under Ukrainian control. But also, if you zoom in, there's another height here called height 1368, which is not within the defenses of the Russian forces. So that's pretty interesting. That shows that maybe the Russians, they don't care as much about this specific height as much as they do about the height a bit to the east of it. But who knows? So the Ukrainians are assaulting that area pretty heavily right now. There is some heavy fighting in that direction, but so far no reports of a breakthrough yet. But I'll show the elevation map to give you guys an idea of what's going on. Sorry, but this is a very rough sketch of the situation, not exact by any means. This is Verbove, this is Robotyne over here, and this is Novoprokopivka. Hill 166, as the Ukrainians are calling it, is located around here, and you can see that it is probably the highest elevated area in the region, besides the ridge that is further to the southeast of Verbove over here, which the Russians have control over, and that's where they may be storing some of their artillery, some of their forward howitzers and mortars. But if we look closer to the battlefield, it is one of the highest elevated areas in the region surrounding Verbove and Robotyne, which is why the Ukrainians, they do want to secure it. It would also give them opportunities to flank the Russian forces to the east in Verbove, and then to the west in Novoprokopivka. So that's the rationale, and that's why the Russians are defending in that region. So while the Ukrainians have been able to make gains around Robotyne and Verbove, this has come at a cost. Just to give you guys an idea of what's going on, here's just a microcosm of that. This is a video from a Ukrainian soldier who filmed damaged Strykers. There's in the video 3 damaged Strykers, 1 damaged T-72, and 1 damaged Cougar MRAP. And at least one of those Strykers was already identified as damaged in a previous video. So this means that there's 2 new ones that have been identified as damaged for the list of damaged Strykers. And here's the video for you guys. Sorry that it's small, but it just gives you an idea of the extent of the damage that the Ukrainians suffered when they launched these attacks through these fields with their armored vehicles. And there were numerous times where they did this, and specifically with the Strykers, that's one of the most recent attacks that helped the Ukrainians advance further through the fields that are to the east of Robotyne, and that was done with the support of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, 46th Air Assault Brigade. And it's not just limited to Strykers, you also have Leopards, and let's actually go to the Leopards. I have a tweet on this that I want to show you guys. So over here you have Germany has updated the list of military aid delivered to the armed forces of Ukraine, and included in that is 10 Leopard 185 tanks. So before, the Germans had sent 10 Leopard 185 tanks, and now they sent an additional 10. And this is out of an estimated 165 185s that the Germans could be sending to the Ukrainians. And this package is interesting. It has some reconnaissance UAVs, tank transporters, all of that. And in terms of the Leopard losses, of the Leopard 2s, there was a Forbes article that came out that claimed that only 5 Leopard 2s were actually destroyed throughout the counteroffensive, throughout the campaign around Robotyne, Tamala, Tokmachka, and that an additional 10 were damaged and that they're being repaired at the moment. Now, this is a pretty interesting claim if it were true, and it would show the resilience of the Leopards, but there is some debate about this because this guy over here, GeoTracker, and I think he does great work. So I'll link this tweet in the description. He actually went through and showed a bunch of footage of leopards being hit, not destroyed. So maybe the 5 number from Forbes is actually correct, but this thread over here, which I'll link, does indicate that there was more than 10 leopards that were actually damaged, and there's probably more that were hit. And there's a difference between what could be considered damage, because there might be serious damage that's taken into account, versus hit, because maybe some of the leopards in these videos that were linked by GeoTracker received relatively minor damage that wasn't counted within the Forbes article. So there is still room for debate, and you can see all of that over here. Now, before I end the video, here is a quick update on the situation around Oruzhenie and the entire Mokriali River Valley. So there are reports of shooting battles to the southwest of Stormayorsk between the Russian forces and the Russian or Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade, because this tank brigade actually has a specific rifle battalion that is involved in infantry fighting on the front lines. But at the same time, there's nothing that's too grandiose. It is just positional warfare at the moment. And what's interesting is that the 35th Marine Infantry Brigade, which was involved in taking back Oruzhenie for the Ukrainians, is now being rotated out after really months of heavy fighting. So it is understandable. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are bringing in additional assault units from specifically the 23rd, and this is the 23rd Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade, and the 31st Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade, and that could indicate future Ukrainian operations around the Mokriali River Valley. So just keep an eye out for Javitny Bazhinaya, but also keep an eye out for Pyutne, where the Russians were forced to withdraw from their forward positions around the heights that overlook the Mokriali River Valley. I talked about this in my last video. The previous front line was around here, where the Russians controlled this red rectangle, and now they've been forced to pull back a couple hundred meters. They still control some of the heights, but the Ukrainians have also been able to take back some of the heights and want to continue pressing and pushing the Russians back even further, including from the village of Pyutne. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.